Hello, and welcome to our Internet Lab Hot Item. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Amanda Third. Amanda is co-director of the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney University in Australia. And today, we are talking about the recent social media ban for minors under 16 in Australia. Let's hear what Amanda has to say. To kick things off, we're going to set the stage and try to understand the ban, because obviously, being from Europe, I haven't followed it as closely as you have. So can you tell us exactly what the ban covers, and then maybe what your take is on what is maybe driving this ban? Is it genuine safety? Is it a safety measure, which is a good thing? Or is it more of a political reaction, some type of knee-jerk reaction to something that happened? And then, if I may add to that, because I know you interact a lot with young people, the ones that will be affected in the first line by this, does this approach actually match up with what young people tell you they need to feel safe online?
So it's a long and complicated story about where this legislation comes from. But I guess to unpack the legislation briefly, it's a piece of legislation that prohibits children under the age of 16 from accessing a social media account. And the idea of it is to better protect children and young people online. I think many Australians have been very concerned that they don't really understand the impacts of social media use on children's and young people's mental health and well-being. And we know, of course, that as in other countries around the world, the youth mental health statistics are quite distressing. And it's a problem that we've had for a long time. It's a complex problem. And we've really not made the kinds of inroads into solving that problem that you perhaps would have liked to have seen. And I think there is a strong perception, leveraging off Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, a strong concern that social media is driving negative mental health outcomes for children and young people. And so this legislation is a response to that, an attempt to try to, really, really sort of prevent children's exposure to harmful content, harmful contact, and to really support them to make the most out of their digital technology engagement. But I think, experts around the country and internationally have raised a series of questions about whether or not this is the right piece of regulation to achieve those goals. I think one of the deep concerns of those experts who have been involved in the debates is that, in fact, this legislation could potentially make children more unsafe online. And the reason for that is that social media accounts are one of the key ways that platforms protect children online. They can assess how old a user is likely to be, more or less, and target appropriate content according to their tastes and preferences. And they can also use social media accounts to target safety measures at children and young people. So I think the concern is that this legislation, while it's very well intentioned and addresses a very real problem, Caroline, is really potentially removing a very important layer of protection, and not really targeting some of the key issues that children confront online. I think children have been very clear that they want to feel safe online, and they want governments, technology companies, schools, parents and carers, NGOs, a whole range of players to take more active steps to protect them online. They feel like it's a shared responsibility. Multiple studies have shown that children really understand that it will take an ecosystemic approach to keep them safe online. They need all the parts of the system working together to ensure that safety. And they also assume a responsibility for their own safety as well. They are cognizant that when they go online, they do encounter potential risks of harm, and they have to be careful. But they go there because they are really driven to connect with their peers. They enjoy a lot of the content. They find it entertaining or relaxing. They also go to social media for information about the issues that they care about. And indeed, it's one of the key ways that children and young people learn about, organise and take action on the issues that affect them. So there's a bunch of really positive things that come out of their digital media use. And as they navigate digital media, rather than doom scrolling, what they're doing is making moment-to-moment assessments about whether or not something is, but the content is something they want to watch, but also whether it's good for them, right? They ask themselves this well-being question, and they only engage when the benefits outweigh the harms. And so they've got a very strong sense often about, what's right, what's good for them, and so on. And we really need to get behind those practices, those what are essentially evaluative practices, in order to augment their safety to the maximum degree. So I think children and young people have been calling for better regulation. I think also experts around the world are calling for stronger regulation. And I think it's a question of what is the best kind of regulation to deliver the outcomes that we want to see for children that protect, respect, and fulfill their rights online.
Thank you. So I understand the fact that the accounts are banned, but that just means that you have to use a desktop most of the time if you want to see content on a lot of social media platforms without having an account. I would imagine. I mean, except for some like Snapchat, but I mean, there are social media platforms that can be accessible without an account. And as you said, then they are not observed, which you can consider good. They're not observed by the platforms, but they're also not protected by the platforms, let's say, because the platforms don't know who's looking then, basically. And I liked your idea of the children being aware that even on social media, it takes a village to kind of raise you online, and to let you know how to behave and what the limits are. What I'm wondering, because I've had teens at home. I actually have still one teen at home just for a couple of more months, and then she's no longer a teen. Um, yes, that happens. Um, will a ban actually stop them? Or if, as some advocates warn, will it just push them in less visible corners of the online world, maybe some darker or some just less known? I mean, I heard something, I read rather something about them going to Yelp and Lemonade. Never heard of these things before, but I'm discovering stuff. I mean, is there just a risk that they, knowing how creative they are and how smart they are in terms of digital, literacy, they will just move elsewhere and we won't know what they're doing at all? And I say we, society, parents, carers.
Yeah, Caroline, it's a really interesting set of questions. And I think experts around the world have been wondering what we really are trying to teach children by removing their access to social media. I think it's certainly very possible that rather than protecting them, we are teaching them the subtle or sometimes not so subtle art of circumvention. Of course, I think we can't underestimate children's desire to connect with each other. In that age group between 13 to 16, which is really the age group that is going to affect, that's the age group that's going to be affected by this new legislation, because of course, currently the kind of default minimum age is 13. When it comes to 13 and 16-year-olds, it's developmentally appropriate that they experience a desire to connect more deeply with their peers. This is the moment in an adolescent's development when their social worlds expand, their sense of their place in the world expands, right? We move beyond very localized sense of who you are and who you connect with into a more expansive set of connections. And so it's entirely appropriate that they want to connect. And so, of course, the temptation here is that they will find other ways to connect. One of the other challenges, I think, with the way that the legislation in Australia is currently framed is that it's at the minister's discretion as to which platforms are deemed, under the legislation and which ones sit outside it. There's no, I guess, exemptions framework which gives a strong rationale as to the criteria that might be used to decide who's in and who's out. And what this means is that we're really going to be playing a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, or to make that sort of a bit more geographically appropriate, maybe it's whack-a-marsupial, around, working out which platforms are in and out. And we're going to need to watch where children and young people migrate. And then those platforms are then going to need to be ruled out. And that's going to, prompt yet another wave of migration and so on. So I think what would be much more effective, to my mind, is rather than banning platforms wholesale, is to draw down on the international literature that shows that some features of social media platforms are much more problematic and even harmful for children and young people, and then to regulate those features. And I think the reason this is better is that it would provide a way for us to decide which platforms comply with the legislation and which don't. But it also gives platforms a set of standards to which they need to design if they're going to engage with children and young people. And I think this would help to incentivize social media platforms to actually design for children, not just to protect them online, but actually to design experiences that are optimal for children in online spaces. I think, often we're not ambitious enough about what we want and hope for with our children online. And so we need better mechanisms that are going to prompt and incentivize businesses to really put children's rights at the heart of everything they do.
One of the points that I found funny first time I heard about the ban, and as I said, it's because my teen is older than 16, so I wasn't even following that, is that one of the big benefits that my daughter had with social media was actually to prepare her IB chemistry test, looking at a teacher that was slightly better than her own teacher's explanations of the chemistry material that she. So I think for me, it's always interesting that social media platforms are looked at like a single use type of platforms, when they are actually multiple use type platforms, where a lot of things that people are looking at are harmless or educational, or they out boxing out of new things, and you think like, I don't see a lot of harm in. I actually find it useful most of the time, or learning how to do something with your car. I'm very bad with cars, changing oil or something, and you go, on a video platform. I was going to say the name of a platform. I just I controlled myself. Um, so it's funny to me that social media is now just like, oh, this is something that is
Yeah.
really, detrimental as a whole to them. And I agree with your idea of maybe some things should be curbed or should be stopped or should be improved. Doesn't mean you have to throw everything out. Um, I think one of the arguments I was also worried me when I read the reaction of digital rights organizations in Europe to that ban is there seemed to be a worry that this ban might backfire by widening the digital divide or preventing kids from learning the resilient skills they need. How do you feel about that? And also, quite simply, you talked about circumvention. the people that will have the means of the VPNs and those type of things, they will just carry on with their merry life, with the help of their parents, without the help of their parents. I mean, depends, but a lot of people don't have the means to add a VPN to the cost of their internet and to things like that, or don't have the digital skills. So how do you see that panning out?
So I think, obviously, some children will find ways to circumvent this, but it require some kind of investment in additional technologies, but it also requires a certain level of digital literacy, right? And I think, it is possible that we'll see a landscape in which, some young people who, for socioeconomic reasons, can't invest in those sorts of technologies won't be able to circumvent the bans. And, really that's ultimately a kind of good thing in terms of what the legislation's trying to achieve. But it does create this playing field that's not at all level between children and young people. And I think, again, this has been one of the rationales for the legislation, is to kind of create that sort of level playing field for all children. They all have the same rules and they all have to abide by them. But I think in practice, the implementation of that is not going to look like it. It's thought to, it's like it's imagined, right? I think it's going to play out very differently. In terms of digital literacies too, I think what we also are worried about is that, social media usage enables children to develop these kind of informal literacies. It largely comes from sharing information with their friends, tips and tricks about how to do things, how to stay safe, and so on. And delaying children's access to social media accounts potentially also delays the development of some of those really critical literacies. And then, of course, they'll get dropped into these environments at age 16, which are likely to be less, less tailored to children, because children aren't supposed to be there. And they'll need really quite sophisticated literacies at that point in order to be able to deal with the content and the contact issues that arise in those spaces. So, and it's not just content and contact, but it's also like critical literacies, like things like mis and disinformation, right? Knowing, you need a long time to learn how to deal with that stuff. So I'm a little bit concerned that we are not thinking about this holistically. We're not thinking about some of the equity issues. It's very rare that blanket determinations work well for everyone, right? We need approaches that actually can be sensitive to difference. And I think the other thing here is that we know that those young people who are most at risk in face-to-face settings are the same young people who are most at risk of harm in online settings. And they tend to be children and young people who, for one reason or another, don't have access to lots of great support, like an attentive parent or carer, or a really strong social network, and so on. And I'm just concerned that actually we are going to be cutting those children and young people off completely from opportunities to socialize, to get the support they need, to find others like them, and that this is really problematic for their mental health. Yeah, and I think also, parents are going to need to step in and play a bigger role, arguably. The idea of the legislation is to reduce the parent burden, but actually, I think because of this circumvention thing, parents are going to have to pay a lot more attention than they do currently. And so again, those children who don't have that parent to play that role are going to be more at risk of harm. So there's lots of reasons why we need to be really cautious, and we need to think very, very carefully. And I would anticipate that, the Australian legislation may well go through a series of quite significant amendments to try to address some of these questions. There is an evaluation underway. It's a very high quality evaluation. It's doing pre and post data gathering, which means we collected data before the bans and also after the bans. And I think we'll really need to scrutinise that evidence in order to really learn what does and doesn't work, what the positive benefits of what the benefits are of this kind of legislation, but also what some of those unintended consequences might be.
I think that's a really interesting approach, that you're taking an iterative approach. Like, okay, we'll reassess it, and I imagine you will reassess it quite regularly, just to see the impact. And that's where I come. The world always talks about the Brussels effect. I'm guessing on this one you have an Aussie effect on the rest of the world. So the whole world is watching Australia right now. Is there, what might European policymakers get wrong if they just copy paste this model without looking at the full context, or without understanding that you are in an iterative process and are collecting evidence to see how you will maybe adapt
Yeah,
this?
look, I think some of our political leaders have certainly stepped out very strongly onto the world stage to represent this legislation. And they have been very keen to assert that it's world first legislation. And I think, inadvertently perhaps have created the impression that it is a much more well thought out piece of legislation than it is in reality. The truth of the matter here, Caroline, is that the legislation was developed very quickly. It was largely driven by political and economic interests, and it wasn't given the kind of it wasn't driven by the evidence and given the kinds of in-depth consideration that we would normally give pieces of legislation of this stature. I think the other thing that the conversation has left out is the fact that actually Australia had been progressively moving towards strengthening the child online protection regulatory system. For some time, we had a series of other mechanisms either in place or in train. So things like a statutory duty of care to, really call technology platforms to account for their responsibilities to children who use their products and services, a children's privacy code, 8 industry codes to really impress on industry the need to prevent children's exposure to sexually explicit and violent content of an egregious nature. A series of different, I won't run through them all, but there were about 8 or 9 different pieces of regulation in process at the time that this legislation came into being. And all of those pieces of regulation, I think, had the right sort of, were motivated by the right sorts of intentions, very dedicated to strengthening different aspects of children's engagement online, or better protecting those aspects of engagement. And this the age restrictions come in over the top of that regulation and potentially actually counteract that regulation, because that regulation assumes that children are going to be on social media platforms, and it's focused on improving their experiences. And the ban comes in and says, well, actually, platforms don't have a responsibility any longer to design for children, because children are not going to be in those spaces, right? So we've got it's a little bit contradictory, and we're going to need to work through how to bring those things together. But so I think if I was to give any words of advice, and maybe it's not my place to do so, Caroline, but I think having watched what's happened here, my advice to decision makers in Europe would be to really scrutinise the Australian legislation, to really try to understand deeply how it works, to really watch closely the results of the evaluation that is being conducted by the E-Safety Commissioner's Office, and to really not exercise too much haste in these matters. I understand that the problems are very urgent, but I also think we need to step carefully to make sure that we are really respecting children's rights. And I think that it would be really worthwhile for governments to do a deep dive on the range of other alternatives that are available to them to address some of these issues. Because I know that the idea of a ban or of, an age of majority, as I think it's being framed there, I know it's a very seductive idea. It looks like it's going to just take the problem off the table. But in practice, it's much more complex than that. And we need to do the hard work to make sure that we develop regulatory systems that can truly address the complexity without punishing children and while holding technology companies to account for their responsibilities. It's not simple, but it's really important that we work together to do this. And I think the other thing that European nations are very good at doing, and which I think is really helpful in this situation, is I think countries do need to come together, identify what those harmful features are, regulate those out, but design, in a sense, international standards. Again, not just to protect children online, but to really assert the need for companies to design outstanding experiences for children, right? If we can set some international standards and then legislate those in separate nations, then we can really collectively call on platforms to do the right thing by children. And I really see the EU as being able to play a key role in those kinds of transnational digital governance mechanisms.
Thank you. I think that was a really useful thing. That the debate is ongoing in Europe, everywhere, I think. So I think looking at the evidence you will be collecting, and that you have collected, and the comparison that you will be doing, I would also I think we need to encourage policymakers to talk to young people, maybe, and involve them much more into, how this is, what is helping them, what isn't helping them, what they find useful, what they don't find useful, and how smart they are in
Yeah,
bypassing things. Maybe they should tell us
100%,
immediately.
Caroline, 100%. So I think one of the really big mistakes that regulators often make in this specific field of children's digital media use is that they don't get that street level understanding of why, how, when children use digital media. And really, the only way to get that is to talk routinely with children and young people about what they do. They have an enormous amount of expertise to share. They are deeply invested in getting good outcomes, and they make fantastic collaborators if you can engage them in the right sorts of ways. And of course, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children under the age of 18 have a right to contribute to the decision making that impacts their everyday lives. And we really need to do much better at respecting that right. There's a lot of wonderful expertise out there about how to work effectively with children. Governments will have the support of a bunch of experts who've been arguing for this kind of engagement with children over the long term. So there's no reason why it can't be done, and it can't be done well. I think, there are sometimes pitfalls to engaging with children and young people. They can be used tokenistically to, endorse pre-existing policy positions. It's really vital that we don't exploit children in that sort of way. It's super important that we commit to a reflective listening process, and a listening process that is ongoing. It's not about single points of connection with children and young people. You want to bring children and young people into the mix to help define the questions you ask, generate the solutions, generate the evidence, and so on. So, yeah, and I think this is actually really vital, given that around the world in Western liberal democracies, what we are seeing is that young people increasingly feel very alienated from political decision-making processes. They feel often let down by the older generation for not taking the urgent action they think is necessary in order to address some of the issues that they care about. And I'm really concerned that if we don't nurture their participation, we've got a major social issue brewing across different jurisdictions. We do really need to think carefully about how we engage the next generation in a meaningful way.
So this is the message to policymakers: talk to your kids, grandkids, nieces, talk around you. If you're bringing someone to soccer practice, talk to the little kids there and see how they feel about it, or the older kids. And yeah, I think I fully agree. It's the way you learn to navigate a car is often by having started with a bicycle. So I think there needs to be a path to learning how to use things that can be real fun but dangerous too. And so that you know how to behave and how to what the pitfalls might be on the open road, let's say, for later on when the speed is higher. So thank you so much, Amanda, for setting this out. I think it will help Europe to understand a bit better what's happening in Australia, and to assess what we tell our kids and our teens at home about what's happening there. So thank you, and please keep up the good work with the committee, and good luck in reviewing what's happening.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Take good care.